Welcome back to part 5 of this tutorial series. Last time we left off completing this Touchdesigner network that allows us to run a deform animation in real time and deploy the output in VR over on the Unity side inside this skybox. However, there are a few more modifications we need to make in Touchdesigner to allow us to start the deform animation from Unity inside the VR scene. Here in Touchdesigner, we have added a receiver for OSC, a protocol for sending simple messages back and forth between applications. When this OSC node receives information from Unity, which is just a random value change, this chop exec will pick it up and start the animation. If you recall, we had a button here before, but now the button has been replaced with a combination of this OSC input and this chop exec, which opens up this code here and begins the deform animation. We'll get back to this later when we get into actually modifying the Python files that start the deform animation. This line of code will need to change based on where your install of Deforum is. This modified Touchdesigner file will be available on my GitHub repo. I'll place a link in the description below. Before we move on to looking at Deforum and how it's installed and how we modified the install, and finally looking at the Unity application and how we're sending the information to initiate this animation from Unity side, let's just finish the remaining nodes in the network here in Touchdesigner to make sure you know exactly what we're doing. So as you can see here, I modified the input image from an octopus to a mermaid face again. And this is the same network we had before, but we didn't go into it in detail. Here we are feeding in the comp into a network which wraps some of the scene around the image. It then gets a slight amount of color correction with this constant, so it blends better in the background. We use a level to reduce the opacity again so it blends better in the background. We use the alpha channel from the image with this threshold and a blur in this matte to cut out a nicer mask around the face. Finally, we matte the image again with the circle just to cut out any garbage that may be on the periphery. This little bit of network here gives a little bit of a wavery water-like animation to the overall image based on this noise and this displacement. Finally, we feed it to an out, which is then composited over the underlying background image from the skybox, and it's sent to a spout, which goes back to Unity. Okay, before we move forward, walking through the local install of Deforum and reviewing the modifications to the code to make all this work, we're first going to need some resources. So I will direct you to this URL, which I will put in the description down below. You will download this file, which has the Deforum install resources for the tutorial. Paste the download file into a clean location so that we can unzip it. Decompress your file, get rid of the archive, and open up the folder so we can review the resources. Once we install Deforum locally, we will use these resources to overwrite some of the files that come in the base install. Okay, let's get started with our Deforum install. Create a new folder for your local install of Deforum and name it Deforum _ current date. Install the Miniconda or Anaconda package manager for Python if you haven't already done so. If you don't know how to do this, please pause and find one of the many YouTube tutorials out there to help you install Miniconda or Anaconda. Go to this URL for the local install of Deforum. I will place the URL in the description below. Download the zip or preferably git clone this address. Go back into the folder you initially created for Deforum, type cmd in the address bar again, and type git clone, the name of the repo, and enter. In moments, you will see the folder appear. Double-click to enter into Deforum Stable Diffusion local. Go back to the address bar and type cmd again. You can step through the installation instructions on the GitHub repo. From the command line, type conda, create, name, give it a name. I'm going to use DSD for Deforum Stable Diffusion _ and today's date, 01/29/23. This helps when you create multiple installs of Deforum in the future. Space Python equals 3.10.6-y, enter. Allow it to do its thing. When it's complete, type conda activate, the name of the environment name you created before, You will then run python setup.py. I will spare you watching the setup go through the process of installing all the dependencies. The install will take a while. Get a cup of coffee or tea and wait until it's finished. Once the install is complete and you have a blinking cursor, we can go to the next step. That is to manually download the 3 models if you don't already have these models. For now, we will follow along with these installation instructions on the GitHub repo, but this will be modified once we get into the custom modifications I've made to the Python file. Before we get into that, let's just get a basic install started to make sure that it's working properly. Going back to the folder where Deforum was installed, that is Deforum Stable Diffusion Local, you will see that there's a model folder inside of this root folder. In this model folder, we will move the initial checkpoint file, this dpt_large-midas file, which will be used for depth masks, and this additional file, adbins_nyu.pt. You can download both of these here and store them in this folder. If you don't already have a checkpoint file downloaded, you can download it from Hugging Face and store the checkpoint in this folder as well. Once you've copied all of your models to this folder, we can go ahead and test. You can copy this line from the GitHub repo installation page, go back to your command line and make sure that you're in the root folder, Deforum Stable Diffusion Local, paste your command there, and hit enter. If everything is working properly, you should see this screen with the percentage bar going across as it is here. Let's check now to make sure we have some animation frames being rendered. Back in the root folder, you can go into Output, the dated folder here, 2023-01, task name, which is the default name given for the animation, and it will show you the frames that have been rendered. This is a good sign showing us that the install was successful. Okay, time to modify the install of Deforum. Here on the right, I have the Deforum install with a couple modifications because I've made all the changes that we're about to show right now, so you won't have exactly the same files here. On the left, I have the 3 folders that we looked at before from the download from my GitHub repo. We're going to start with this first folder here that says Place Contents in Deforum Stable Diffusion Local, which is this folder right here. So what you're going to do is you're going to copy over these 4 files from the left to the right. I'm not going to do that because I've already done that. And when you're finished, you'll have a updated run.py, a new run_deforum.bat, and this run settings.txt. You will also have a run settings template file that will be in there by default from your install, which I'm not showing here because I deleted it. And I also have this octopus file, which you will not have. But these are the files that will be important for you to be able to use the modifications to work with Touchdesigner. Again, run.py, run_deforum.bat, infile.txt, and this settings file here. Next, you're going to go up into Deforum Stable Diffusion, Helpers, and then go into this folder here that says Place Contents in Deforum Stable Diffusion, Local Deforum Stable Diffusion Helpers. You're going to copy all of these files. You're going to pull them over and overwrite the files in this folder. Again, I'm not going to do that because I already did do that. Okay, next what we're going to do is we're going to go into the output folder, and you're going to go into this folder here that says Input Output Folder Structure in Deforum Root, and you're going to copy over these folders from output into this folder. Copy here. You're going to go up, and you're going to go into the input folder, and you're going to grab this image and drag it over. So I initially created this image in Stable Diffusion, and I set the background to red, and as we'll see in a moment, inside of one of the Python files I modified, there is some FFmpeg code that will key out this color red in my image, creating an alpha channel. So you can feel free to create any image you want as your initial image, which is what this is, or you can just use this as your initial image just to make sure your system is working. So we're going to need the paths that we set up here a little bit later as we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a notepad file, and I'm going to copy these paths just so we have them at a convenience as we go. So this is going to be our input. I'm going to go back into the output, and what we care about here are the paths of these folders. So we want this archive folder, go up a level. We want this base folder B, go up a level, and we want this base folder loading. In a moment you'll see how these other folders work in our code. But if you have these paths, you'll be all set. Now let's go into our Stable Diffusion install again. Let's start with our settings folder. I'm going to right click and click edit to open it up in Notepad. And I'm going to go here to this line where it says initial image. And I'm going to change it to what we set before, which is the location of the input image or the initial image. So you would replace this path here with this path, making sure that you keep the double backslashes so they're recognized properly when the code is run. Okay, that should work. We're going to save this, and I'm not going to go into details here, but you'll see that the main prompts are here. They're essentially 80 frames, and since we have a diffusion cadence of 2, we'll wind up with 78 frames total. Again, not going to go into the details. I will just point out that we do have depth warping set to true so that we have a depth map being created. That's all we need to change in here. I'm going to close. Next, we're going to go into the run_deforum.bat, right click, and edit in Notepad++. Here you're going to change this line to the location where you installed Deforum. The next thing you want to do is make sure that the name of the environment that you created earlier and the command line matches. And also, if you installed Miniconda, you should be all set. But if you didn't and installed Anaconda, you may have to change this here from Miniconda 3 to Anaconda. Lastly, this line here that runs the run.py file is important. As we'll see, it points to the settings, which is in the same location as the bat file itself. So that's this file here, and it is pointing to run settings.txt. This is the model that I'm using. You can change this to whatever models you have available. So your checkpoint would go in here. You don't need a path. We'll show you in a moment where that's going to be taken care of. But here is just the name of the model. And modified init anim state, you can leave at 5. We'll see later where this comes into play, but essentially this means that we're going to be using FFmpeg to strip out the color key we talked about earlier, that red color, and create an alpha channel. So once this is set up, you can close this out and save it if you made any changes. And next we're going to go into this run.py file. So right click, open up in Notepad++, go down a little further and ensure you change model path to the actual path of the location on your hard drive where your Stable Diffusion models are stored. So before, when we installed Deforum and we ran our check to make sure the installation worked properly, we had the 3 models that were identified here in the install from the GitHub repo placed into this folder here. So this was the actual root of the local install. Here was the model folder, and we had the main checkpoint, the Midas file, and this other file. They were all in this model folder. Once you modify the Python code in run.py and change this models path to the custom path that is the location on your hard drive where you store all of your checkpoints, you will also need to move the Midas file and this add a bins file that were formerly in this models folder here to the path that you place here in this run.py file. Please make sure that you remember to do this, otherwise you will get an error and it will not work. The other path that's important to change is the output path. Luckily, we have this here. This is the main path for the output for our folder B. So we're going to change this as well. And again, make sure to respect the double backslashes so it works properly. Save. And that's it for this file. Okay, now that we've modified the run.py file, now we're going to go into Stable Diffusion, Helpers, and right-click on render.py. Open it up in Notepad++. And I want to just point your attention to one other thing you're going to need to change just in case for some reason you want to change the background color of your initial image. Down here at around line 304, you'll see it says remove alpha. And if you look a little bit further down, you'll see this line here, color key. So this is one of the parameters that are passed to FFmpeg. And this is a reddish color, this hexadecimal color. So you can change this to any hexadecimal number for the color that you're interested in if you want to change it from this current red color to some other color. That's information you should use. And this similarity here of 0.3 is basically adjusting the sensitivity of how closely other pixels are related to this color. So if you want to kind of capture almost everything that's closely related to red, you might go a little bit higher than 0.3, but I found that 0.3 actually works pretty well for the color that I used. Okay, that's about it for this file. Okay, we can go ahead and give this a test. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this output folder and go into B. And we're going to open up alpha and watch as the animation frames are created one at a time once we double click the run_deforum.bat. So here we go. You can see we are using the settings file. We are using this checkpoint, and the modified init animation state is set to 5, which means we will be using alpha. It's loading the model, and it will take a little time to do what it needs to do to get up and running. Shouldn't take any more than a minute or two, depending on the speed of your computer. Okay, good sign. Moving along nicely. And saving animation frames to the place that we designated. And we're starting to see animation frames being created. And here we go. I'm going to just turn on a few large icons. And we are successfully creating our images with alpha. Nicely matted. Just go up and take a look at some of the other folders here. Here's our base images, and here are our depth masks. So everything working nicely. This version of Deforum creates a nice little settings file for you so you can review your settings here. And it will continue to do this until it hits 78 frames. Okay, here we are in the output folder. It's clear that our animation ran properly. We have 78 frames inside this alpha folder, showing us that Deforum ran properly after we made all the modifications to the code. And we also have images in the base folder and the depth mask folder as well. The other thing that I did was I copied these 3 folders here in the output B to the output loading. So these are duplicate images, and the reason we need this is because back on the Touchdesigner side, we need to make sure there is a loading movie available when we're doing our real-time animation. So we need to go back into Touchdesigner and make sure that Touchdesigner is pointing to all of these output folders, and also that the bat file is showing the correct path so that we can generate our Deforum animation from Unity. So let's go back into Touchdesigner and take a look. We have to make sure that this path is pointing to the correct location for this run_deforum.bat. And if we go into here, that is the root folder. This here is the same as this, and it is pointing to this run_deforum.bat. So I am good to go. Make sure you make the change on your side in your copy of this Touchdesigner file. And the other 2 very important path locations that need to be changed inside this Touchdesigner file are over here in this chop exec. You must make sure these 2 paths are pointing to the correct output folders, alpha and loading. So I've already done that. Just make sure on your side you're pointing to output B alpha and output loading in order for all this to work properly. And the other change that needs to be made is that these 3 movie file ends need to all be pointing to that new output folder that we had set up over here in our Deforum install that we just looked at. I've already made these changes, but just as a quick refresher, let's just look at the movie loading. So what you do is you right click, hit parameters, open this up, click the plus icon for the file, make sure you're in the right path. I am in this case loading alpha, grab an image, delete the actual image itself, so we're selecting the full folder, and then come down here and just as a test, click reload loading. And as you can see, it's working nicely. I did the same for these. B1 and B are pointing to the new paths as well. And again, you'll do the same. You can see here, this is the install we did together. Here's the output folder. That's B, that's alpha. And as you know, these both are pointing to the same place. So this Touchdesigner file is complete. We can now move over to the Unity side. So here in Unity, we also have to make some modifications to paths. So all these paths need to change to the paths that we have set up for our new local install of Deforum. Just take a look here and make sure everything's working properly, that it is indeed picking up the animation from Touchdesigner. It is. You'll see that this button here is what we're going to click when we're in VR. It will initiate the real-time generation of animations via Deforum by sending a command with OSC that's going to be picked up by the OSC node in the Touchdesigner network. So without getting into the details of the code, the only thing we really need to do here is make sure these paths are correct. So I'm going to go into this script here and change all these paths so they're pointing to the right place. I'm going to open up my notepad And let's take a look at this one here. So we have output folder B path for alpha, base, and depth. And we're going to highlight the path. And I want to just change up to this B here. And I'm going to do the same for base and the same for depth. So now these are all pointing to the correct place. Okay, we're going to do the same thing down here, but this is for loading. I'm going to go back into here. I'm going to grab this path, same way. I'm going to change everything up to loading. Do the same thing again for base. And lastly, the same thing again for depth. Okay, the last thing we need to do is change where this archive folder is pointing. So let's go back into our notepad, grab the archive path, and update it the same way. I'm going to go all the way up to archive, and now everything is updated. So I'm going to save this, and we're now ready to run our whole process. But just really quickly, just kind of an overview to let you know why we were bothering with these paths. So when we click this button here in Unity and we set off the new deform animation, the first thing Unity is going to do is it's going to take what it currently has in the loading folder and back it up to archive. And then it's going to copy over what it has in the B folder and move that into the loading folder. So this way you'll have a running history of animations that you've created previously, just in case there's something that you really loved and you'd want to use again. The process in Unity is preserving essentially anything that you create in your real-time deform animation by backing up loading and repopulating loading with the current B. And that's what's going on here. Okay. Let's give this a full-on test run. We're going to put on the VR headset. We're going to go inside of the scene. We're going to push the button, and we're going to watch how the animation is created in real time while we sit back and relax and look at the view from VR. Okay, guys, here we are in the 360 environment. I am wearing the MetaQuest headset. We are looking at a previously rendered deform animation nicely blended into the skybox. In a moment, I will push this button, and when I do, we will create a brand new deform animation on the fly, which will seamlessly blend into the current animation as we watch here in VR. So the new animation is going to be an octopus, so it'll be obvious when it changes. So here we go. Okay. So as you may see from the CMD screen that popped up, the deform animation has begun, but here in VR it is completely seamless and you would have no idea that anything was going on behind the scenes, which is the whole point of this exercise. So it will take a little while for Deforum to come up to speed and begin to generate the animations, and we had set a threshold of 15 frames, so it's not until 15 frames that we'll see the switch over from this loading animation into the new animation, which I said was going to be an octopus. So in the future, what I'm going to add to this project is the ability for a user to interact with some kind of UI that will allow the person to create Stable Diffusion images right here in this environment. So it will become sort of an AI-generated workshop where you'll have deform animations playing in the environment in the background, and you'll have the ability to create Stable Diffusion images in front of you, which will render to small placards or large placards, depending on whether how you want to scale them, because you'll have the ability to scale, position, and rotate them anywhere you like in the environment, and the environment will be saved. So when you come into the next session, you'll be able to see everything you've placed before. I also intend to include some teleportation ability to move around the environment, add some multiplayer functionality, and even some gaming to this, where I can imagine two users playing against each other, creating images and animations as if they were two wizards dueling or something along those lines. I have some other ideas that I've experimented with, which include depth maps to give a sense of depth within VR, and I had some success with some of that as well, and we're going to incorporate all of that as well in future tutorials. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial series so far, you've learned something. And please do consider subscribing. Oh, here we go. There's our octopus. As you can see, it just popped up and blended in nicely. And now we're going to have this octopus continue to reload gracefully as the frames build. And you can see, you can tell when it's reloading, but it's very subtle. And as the frames grow, and as we get closer to the full 78 frames, it will be more and more difficult to tell when the octopus is reloading. But that's sort of the point of this project. Of course, 78 frames is not a limitation. It's just a number that I used for the purposes of this tutorial. So again, I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Hope you learned something. Please do put some comments down in the comments below as far as what you'd like to see in the future or what you enjoyed. And do hit the bell notification icons. Please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell notification so you'll be notified when the next part of this tutorial becomes available.